Hey, everybody. I'm very, very excited to join you all today for another edition of Wake Up Call Live. And joining me today is licensed professional counselor Heather McPaul. Hi, Heather. Thank you for
Hi,
being here.
thank you for having me.
Of course, I've been so dying to just dive right into this conversation. We were just laughing. It was hard for us to not start talking already before we went live. But we are here to talk about specifically borderline personality disorder. And the reason this has become a little bit more relevant in our culture today is because, as we all know, the Depp v. Heard trial, which anybody who follows me on social media knows that I have been utterly obsessed with the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. And I wanted to talk to someone like you, Heather, to really understand more what borderline personality disorder is, what
hmm
it looks like, how does it affect the average person, and also how do you treat it? So I would like to tell our audience that you sort of specialize in treating trauma,
Yeah.
and we're going to go a little bit more into how does that relate to borderline personality disorder. So thank you once again for being here to talk about this today.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's get right into it. From your perspective as a mental health professional, what is borderline personality disorder?
So, borderline personality disorder is made up of about 9 different criteria, although you only need 5 of which to meet the standard for having that diagnosis. And it's mostly characterized as, um, you know, at least from a trauma perspective, trauma that happens during those formative years where you're building attachment to your primary caretakers. There's something about that relationship that was dysfunctional and caused a lot of shifts in how we developed identity after that. And it's interesting bringing up the Amber Heard diagnosis because Depp's, I think people had that diagnosis. They came up with that, if I'm not mistaken.
That's
And
my understanding, yes.
and her people that had her diagnosed came up with PTSD, I think. And what's interesting about that is that a wise man once told me that if what happened to us as children happened to us as adults, we would call it PTSD. But because these things happen during those formative years where you're building identity, it manifests as a personality disorder. And so what that looks like in terms of like what we mean by trauma there is it could be abuse, physically, sexually, emotionally. It could be, anything that made those primary caretaker relationships icky, cold, avoidant, insignificant, whatever. And we know so much more now about how that affects development for children. But how it looks in terms of a borderline diagnosis is they often have chaotic relationships with other people, and not just intimate partners, but friendships as well. They have a hard time regulating their emotions because that attachment to their primary caretaker was not consistent or supportive or whatever. They never learned how to self-soothe in a safe environment. And so they have very intense emotions and very little tools to actually deal with it, which is why you often see them use self-harming behaviors or risky behaviors to try to manage those emotions. So like cutting is a big one. Sometimes they use sex to self-soothe, drugs, substances, all binge eating, all kinds of ways. And they kind of live in that extreme place. There is no like in between where like you and I can sit here and say, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. They're like, no, it's all or nothing. It's very polarized thinking, and that's a lot of times what causes, all of that emotion they don't know what to do with. And then they use these sometimes not so healthy ways of handling it.
So, for
Um,
instance, like if, something that I have observed from what I have seen of the trial is it seems that, for instance, like routinely we've seen throughout the case that when Amber would be trying to argue with Johnny, his immediate reaction would be to sort of pull away and leave, run away. And she was
Yeah.
constantly accusing him of that.
Yeah. The
What?
biggest thing one of the biggest things in this diagnosis is a frantic effort to avoid real or imagined abandonment or rejection. That is a huge trigger for them. So walking away from them when they're having an emotion and they're needing, what they think is attention for that emotion or support for that emotion, is a huge trigger, and it will ignite drastic, effort sometimes in order to fight that avoidance, to fight that, bring that person back, because that's like the worst thing they can think of is,
Yeah.
being rejected or abandoned.
Yeah, and the way that's being presented or characterized by, depending on who you talk to in the trial, you can spin it either way, right, on either side. But the way that's sort of being characterized is that, here is Johnny trying to extract himself from the situation, and you've got Amber who's being the aggressor, or at least that's how it's being characterized. But it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, that could just be characterized as her acting out her borderline personality.
Sure. I mean, when we instill boundaries with someone who didn't grow up with them, or has a very, warped view of what those should look like, because they don't have an idea of what healthy relationships look like. And they also get enmeshed with people they're in relationship with. They don't have a fully developed sense of self. In their evolutionary development, their emotional functioning was stalled. So they don't have a real sense of self. So they're often like enmeshed with and codependent in those relationships. And so if let's hypothetically say that was a boundary for him. He was like, I'm not going to engage in this behavior. She's interpreting that hypothetically as abandonment in her, moment of need. And it just creates this big, that's kind of the nature of these things. And it's interesting because I think she admitted on the stand, when they were talking about the James Franco thing the other day, that she had exhausted all of her friendships. And that makes a lot of sense, because when there's untreated stuff like this, you're going to exhaust the people around you, because you're going to keep, engaging in these chaotic, like, dynamics. And when people start to put that boundary of like, this is not okay with me, it just creates more dysregulation emotionally for them.
So they unwittingly alienate people.
I often think that they'll test relationships often because they're so scared of being abandoned that they'll often test the relationship. Are you going to leave me? Are you going to leave me? Like, and sometimes the stakes get bigger and bigger. And eventually, you push someone long enough, and, if they have any sense of what is, toxic here, they will eventually.
So many people experience trauma as a kid, like what you've described with their caretakers. Do they all end up having borderline?
Well, no.
Like,
there's several different personality disorders, but some people don't end up with personality disorders. There's a lot of factors that go into this. Sometimes the severity of the trauma. Sometimes there's genetic, biological factors that, we're still not really sure exactly what creates one rather than another. And also sometimes it's that, depending on the parent figures and what they've got going on, in their mental health as well.
Okay, I feel like I want to go down like a whole rabbit hole, but I have to save some of these topics for another conversation. I want to kind of stay more focused on the topic for today.
Mm-hmm.
So when would somebody really start to present symptoms of borderline personality?
Well, I think in most cases with, things like personality disorders in general, or even things like bipolar, generally they will start to notice in those teenage years. In fact, a lot of places won't diagnose a personality disorder until they're more around those, late teenage years, just to make sure. Because the fact of the matter is, when you're a kid and you're hormonal, you can kind of present that way anyway.
Great.
So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So, because I don't want anybody who's watching to be like, oh my God, I had a, disruptive childhood. I think that I might have borderline personality.
No, but, I
It's
think,
more extreme, right?
well, I mean, everybody's different. And so if there is a question out there about, well, I have trauma, what does that mean? Regardless, I think the answer is just to go to therapy and process what that was. Because honestly, the label isn't as important as, is your past stuff showing up in your present? Do you have healthy relationships? Are you happy? Are you content? Are you, managing your emotions? Do you have any issues around that? And just finding a way to get some help for that.
Okay, so it would be more like somebody like, I think we can probably all agree that what we've heard thus far about Amber's life, that it's been very chaotic, that their relationship was very toxic. It wasn't just like a normal couple having some arguments here and there.
Right.
So and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but if somebody were to have borderline personality, they would probably find themselves in frequent chaos, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. It might look like, all of your friends, seem to, I think it appears to them that everybody leaves them, that they have no stable relationships, that the ones that they do are like, frustrating and dramatic. And yeah, I think that's probably an interesting thing for people to kind of look into and see what that's about, because it is one of the biggest things that we'll notice right away is like, well, what's consistent here,
And I think you mentioned to me before that one of the sort of signs of borderline personality is that they have a craving to be the center of attention. Can you talk more about that?
Well, when you think about that dysfunctional attachment that was from those early, childhood years, oftentimes things, especially if there's abuse, there wasn't a safe way to be attended to by your parent. So there is this desperate need to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. And that's part of that abandonment thing too. If that wasn't there, now I have to worry about, is everybody going to do this to me? But there is this sort of need to be seen, and they figure out that the way they have to do that has to be flashy, or no one's going to notice. It has to be big. Sometimes they go to extremes in order to get that attention met. It is as if they are kind of replaying what didn't happen in their childhood and trying to make it happen now, except it doesn't work that way, because relationships don't work like that. Yeah. So,
are they often negative though? Or could it just be like, probably every celebrity who's been fame hungry, well, you could have this, right?
And when we initially talked, you had said something about, what do you think about that diagnosis for Heard? And I said, we can't know that for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised, because people who have borderline or histrionic or even narcissistic personality disorder, they tend to gear themselves towards careers that will give that to them, that attention, that spotlight. So it's really not surprising if you look back at things like these reality TV shows, there is a lot of that playing out, that attention seeking, and I hate to use that term, but when you realize where it really comes from, it's not that stigmatizing. It's coming from something very young inside that never got its needs met. And so, of course, what could be better for that than this giant platform where the whole world is watching?
Yeah. I'm thinking about what happened with Will Smith at the Oscars, and the public reaction to that was partly from some people was Will was acting out his own trauma by doing that. I don't want to make this about Will Smith, but some of his background was that he has issues because he feels that he failed to protect his mother from domestic abuse by his father, and that he was sort of replaying this dynamic out on stage, and that maybe people should have a little more compassion for him. Poor Chris Rock, but if people can see that dynamic, it's interesting to me that Amber is not getting a lot of sympathy by the public. People seem to be mostly Team Johnny.
I think because they're not exploring these diagnoses and helping people understand what that means, but the other thing here, and I teach this to my clients all the time, you can understand why someone is the way that they are, and you can, have compassion for that, but you're also allowed to be wounded by that, and you don't have to choose one over the other. They're both equally valid. So, I can recognize that someone, has this issue and where it comes from. I also don't have to choose to engage in it either, because that's not healthy for me, you know?
Yes. Oh, yeah. So you're talking about from the perspective of Johnny, that he didn't have to engage in it too.
Yeah, but also from the audience's standpoint, we don't want to minimize somebody's pain or trauma, but we also don't want to accept it as okay because of that.
Yes, it's not an excuse.
Right.
It's not an excuse.
No, but it's a good indicator that there's something to work on here, because to your point, we repeat what we don't repair.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I wish I could take credit for it.
Yeah, well, it's a good soundbite, but I guess we'll have to figure out where that. Do you know who originally said that, or is that just something that's around in the mental health community?
I feel like, yeah,
okay.
Probably it.
And lawyers have a bunch of those too. So I want to talk about how you treat borderline personality disorder. Is it, putting this in finger quotes, is it curable?
Well, that's largely debatable, but it's my belief that it can be treatable, in that we can create more insight, we can build that sense of self, we can stop some of the all of the extreme behaviors, we can re-regulate the system, we can heal what put it all there to begin with. Will there still be thoughts in the head that go, oh, I'm going to poop in his bed now? Maybe, but you won't do it. You know what I mean? Like,
okay.
I think we all sometimes have those thoughts about, like, ooh, I just love to, but we don't. And that's where we kind of get borderlines back to. And sometimes that's an effort, sometimes it takes a lot of work to, retrain the brain to think differently. But, the golden treatment for borderline used to be dialectical behavioral therapy, which is great. It focuses on mindfulness and emotional regulation and interpersonal effectiveness so that you can, connect in healthy ways. And it's great. But for me, I much more prefer to use EMDR to treat my most of my clients, borderline or not. And the reason for that is because it goes straight to the source of that pain. And EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. So we really go back to the roots and dig it out so that it's not impacting your now anymore, because everything back there is affecting how you live now and how you relationship now and how you see yourself now. So
tell me more about that. I have heard of it. I don't know how new it is, but I think most people that go to therapy are probably not getting this, because I don't hear a lot about it. So can you tell me, take me through what you do when you're getting EMDR therapy?
Yeah. So how when you go to sleep at night, your eyes in REM cycle go back and forth. For whatever reason, that eye movement is attached to how we process information. We don't really know why, but that's what happens. So when you go to sleep at night, you're processing your day and whatever. And oftentimes we'll have nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, because that stuff, if it's traumatic, it never really fully gets processed at night. So it sticks with us. And the more we push it off, the more it manifests in other ways. It can even manifest in terms of like health conditions, chronic health illnesses. And there are certain, chronic illnesses associated with unresolved childhood trauma as well. So in EMDR, we find, a memory, a root, an image that represents that, traumatic incident. And oftentimes we have, protocol to float back to find whatever it is. And then we use eye movements very intentionally to finally put it away while sort of desensitizing the trauma of it, the emotional part of it. And so basically we take the memory, we take the emotion off of it, we process the emotion, we throw it away. And now you just look back and you're like, yeah, that happened to me, but I don't really feel anything about it.
There's no characterization or emotion attached to it.
Yeah. So you can look back and you're just like, yeah, that happened to me. It's not cool, but it happened. And then you notice that, like, because that's not there anymore, the way you behave now, that's really the marker of it working, is like, oh, I didn't even do that thing I used to do, when I got stressed or whatever it is.
It's so like a cleansing.
Yeah, it's a purging. Yeah. Like
cleaning out your lint thing on your dryer.
Yeah. Or as my old boss used to say, it's like a good bowel movement,
I was thinking colonics.
Yeah. Yeah, because we don't need it anymore. It's old stuff, And so it allows people to live freer, to not have all this emotional baggage, and it helps them get in touch of what's really true, because oftentimes borderlines, they get in that black and white thinking and this extreme thinking, and they don't see the reality of it. It's very personalized, it's very internalized. And so EMDR helps that kind of like part the clouds so they can see the whole picture,
So how do you find the memory? Like, what would it feel like if I was at a session with you? Like, how would we find the memory?
Well, I would probably start by asking you why are you here now? Like, what's coming up now? And let's say, you're, the person you're with, makes you angry and you have all these, outbursts or whatever. So we would take the ingredients related to that memory, the present issue. What do you feel in your body? What are the emotions associated with them? What's the image that represents the worst part of that recent incident? And then we would kind of take those ingredients and float back to earlier times in your life where you felt that way too. And we'll see how far back we can go. And so this is what we would call like a memory network. And everything on that memory network, when we start doing we call it bilateral stimulation. I like eye movements. Some people use tactile. They'll like hold things in their hands and they vibrate back and forth. There's also auditory, but I've never used that before. I guess it beeps back and forth. But the idea of bilateral stimulation kind of, replicates that REM cycle. And so we would, wherever we go, that as we do the eye movements or whatever, we start processing through whatever's attached to that, all the way through your life, whatever's attached to that memory network. In doing that, there's also, and I forgot this ingredient, I'll ask you, what's the negative belief you have about yourself when you think of that memory? There's always an internalized belief. Maybe it's, I'm not good enough, or I don't matter, something like that, or I'm not safe. And I would also ask you, like, well, what do you want to believe about yourself instead? What's the positive thing? Well, I am safe, or I'm okay now, or I am good enough. And as you start to process through the trauma, the negative belief about yourself gets less true, and the positive belief gets more true. And it just happens naturally. Your brain knows how to do this process. We're just basically putting jumper cables on it and letting it go. And so people are often like, wow, when they do EMDR, because number one, they had no idea where it was going to go. They were surprised. But also they're like, I haven't thought about these things in years, or, I can't believe I used to think that way, you know? So it's very cool stuff.
Now, how often would someone need to do this? And, how frequently, for how long to
So
really see the
usually
benefit?
what I tell people is like, if you didn't have much stuff in your life in terms of mental health, challenges, whatever, and you got into a car accident, it may be just a few sessions to get you back in your car without, having anxiety about it. When we're talking about personality disorders or childhood trauma, it could take us a long time. There's really no telling how long this could go on for. And the reason why I say that about the childhood stuff is because we're talking about decades of wiring this way, of behaving this way, of believing this way. So it's a little bit more complicated. And so it takes a lot longer to, tease all that out, because there could be several, instances, there could be several different negative beliefs. And so it's our job to just knock them out one by one.
Is this something people can do on their own, or do they really need to work with a professional to do this?
They really need to work with a professional, because there's a whole protocol around making this a safe environment to do that, giving you tools to help if you do become dysregulated, because sometimes things will come up while they're processing and they might have a reaction to it, and they kind of need us to like coach them through it. There is a book called Francine Shapiro wrote it. I think it's called Healing Your Past or something like that. And that is written for anybody to read, and it is about EMDR. But if you're going to do a full, processing of your trauma, you really need somebody who is trained and certified to do that with you.
Okay. Well, and if you can find the book, we can put a link in the comments.
I will do that. Let me write that down.
And you and I had started to talk about, before we went live, I had talked about this book that I've read about trauma, and it's called Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to give our viewers the benefit of hearing that conversation, because you sort of made a comment that, was like sort of in jest, but not really, is that we all have trauma.
We do. We do. And we often dismiss we always say capital T, little t trauma, right? Most people will say their little t traumas are not trauma. That's nothing, whatever. Everybody, things like divorce for children can be traumatic. As adults, we go, whatever. But really, losing a parent at an early age, witnessing something. There's so many different things that could be categorized as trauma. Nobody gets out of childhood without a scar or two,
Yeah.
Even if you're, and I hear this all the time, my parents were great. I didn't need anything. Like, I had a great childhood. And usually that's a red flag to me of like, why would you be here, really? Like, there's something there. There's always something to look at. And, there's no stigma attached to that. Everybody, I'm a little biased, but I feel like everybody should be in therapy,
Yeah.
But there's always something, whether you got bullied in school or, the pressure of trying to, be good enough and perfect, or, grief is traumatic on its own. There's so many things. I think oftentimes we hear, PTSD, or we hear trauma and we think combat, right?
Yes.
Everybody thinks of that. Yeah. It's so much more nuanced than that,
Yeah. And I think what I observe with a lot of people is some people are very happy to criticize their parents, but then there are other people that really feel like they love their parents deeply, and they feel like it's a betrayal to disrespect them in that way, to recognize that they have flaws or that they didn't parent perfectly. And, maybe you could talk about your experience with that with your clients, but I would tell everybody, you can still love your parents. You can still respect your parents. They did their best. They loved you. but it also doesn't mean that they were perfect parents.
Yeah, I tell most of my clients that are parents, you're going to screw up your kids no matter what. And that's because we're not perfect and we're never going to be. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, you can understand why someone is the way that they are and why they do what they do. You're also allowed to be wounded by that. And you don't have to choose one over the other. They can both be true. Our parents did the best they could with the tools that they had. Sometimes parents don't have the best tools. It's just
Yeah.
how it is, It's nobody's fault, it just is.
Yes. And a lot of people too, they sort of parent the way that they were parented. So a lot of that,
Mhm.
I'll just call it like genetic or generational baggage.
Generational trauma is what we would call it.
All right, see, I'm onto something here.
Yeah, yeah.
We sort of pass it on, right?
Yeah, we
And
do,
unless
yeah.
you kind of, actually, there was a custody expert that I worked with one time who said, sort of jokingly, but again, it was true that, you do your best to kind of fix your own trauma that you've learned that your parents passed on to you so that you can create something new that you will then pass on to your children.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so, I mean, we're kind of joking about it, but I hope that what people take away from this conversation is that, you can have your trauma. There's not a contest to see who's got the worst trauma, right?
No,
Um,
no.
and you can deal with that and explore, where you may have experienced that in your childhood. You can still love your parents when you're doing it.
That's right.
And, so that maybe you can impart something different to your own kids.
Yeah, and just live happier and less, pressured and less angry and less, and more connected, because I think that's what we're supposed to be doing here, is
Yeah.
connecting.
And another comment I want to make too is that I often hear people say about something that seems pretty terrible that happened to them in their lifetime. Oh, well, you know what though, I could have had it so much worse, and then they
Mhm.
count their blessings, and I think that's wonderful that they can do that. But it doesn't change the fact that you did have a traumatic experience, and maybe you should explore that a little bit.
I absolutely agree. As a culture, we tend to minimize things, and say, "Oh, that couldn't have affected me that much." But it's interesting to think about. Well, what is unresolved in your life now? What isn't working for you? And there's usually, all roads lead to Rome, as I usually say. So there is always something to look at there and work with.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. There's so much more that we could go into. Maybe if you can make some time for me, we can find some other topics.
Always, yeah.
But I just want to point out to everybody that if you'd like to learn more about Heather, you can find her on the internet at symmetryofself.com. And I also have a link to that in the notes. I'm going to post it here. And you can also find her on Instagram at Symmetry of Self. So I highly recommend that you check her out. And
Thank you.
yeah, thank you again, Heather.
So
Thanks
much
for
fun.
watching.
Thanks.